It all began with what I thought would be a simple, joyful celebration. My birthday. After a long year of work, stress, and the monotony of everyday life, I decided to throw the kind of backyard party that only appears in Instagram feeds. Balloons, fairy lights, a sound system for music, and a modest buffet for friends and neighbors. I even bought a small inflatable pool for the kids, imagining laughter filling the yard while adults chatted in the warm evening air. The planning was meticulous. I sent invitations weeks in advance, keeping the guest list intimate, people I genuinely liked and trusted. I carefully read the HOA rules to ensure I didn't cross any boundaries. After all, I had already learned from past minor HOA infractions that even tiny missteps could provoke trouble. Lawn ornaments, holiday decorations, and fence heights had all been fair game for scrutiny. I thought I knew my neighborhood. I thought I was careful. I was wrong. The day of the party arrived, sunny and perfect. The yard was vibrant, adorned with pastel balloons swaying in the breeze. Tables were stacked neatly with snacks and drinks, and the pool shimmered invitingly in the sun. My friends arrived, laughter and music filling the space in a way that reminded me why I loved gatherings so much. Everything was going perfectly, until I noticed her. She appeared quietly at the edge of the yard, arms crossed, her expression a perfect blend of indignation and suspicion. The neighborhood knew her as Karen, the unofficial self-appointed watchdog of our HOA. She had an uncanny ability to spot the smallest perceived violations. A leaf out of place, a mailbox not centered perfectly, or a garden gnome too large for her liking. Her gaze swept across the party, lingering on every detail, as if cataloging evidence for a case only she could see that I tried to ignore her. After all, she wasn't in my guest list, and she had no invitation. But by the time the first few neighbors began greeting her, it was clear she had mobilized. Phones were out. Cameras were subtly pointed toward my property. My music, which had seemed innocent just minutes ago, now seemed loud and chaotic under her scrutiny. Every laugh, every cheer from my guests, felt like it was magnified into a violation in her mind. By mid-afternoon, the situation escalated. A printed notice, crisp and formal, appeared at my front door. The HOA had issued a warning about noise levels, crowd size, and potential property infractions. According to the notice, my backyard party was now technically a breach of community rules. The tone was icy, bureaucratic, and unmistakably Karen. A declaration that my fun had crossed a line I hadn't realized existed. I felt a mix of shock, frustration, and incredulity. I had followed every written rule to the letter. My invitations were carefully curated, my decorations modest, and my setup temporary. The fact that one person could mobilize the HOA machinery over a birthday party seemed absurd, almost surreal. Yet the notice was there, official, and clearly meant to intimidate. I glanced at the balloons, the pool, the cheerful chaos of my friends, and a simmering feeling of rebellion began to take root. This wasn't just about noise. It was about control. It was about Karen asserting her dominance over the neighborhood, reminding everyone that she and the HOA decided what was permissible and I was a target. The unfairness of it fueled my determination. I realized that giving in quietly would only embolden her. The small rebellion that began as mild irritation slowly grew into a plan for justice, or at least poetic revenge. The rest of the party unfolded under a quiet tension. My friends noticed the change in atmosphere. I tried to keep things cheerful, but every glance toward the fence revealed Karen lingering, snapping photos or taking notes. Her presence was a silent challenge. She wanted me to feel the weight of her disapproval. I, on the other hand, began mentally drafting my response. I started documenting everything: the placement of tables, the noise levels, the timeline of events. I knew that if this escalated, I needed proof that my actions were within reason, and more importantly, that Karen's interference had gone beyond simple concern into active sabotage. By the time the party wound down, the sun had dipped low, and the last guests had left. The yard, once vibrant with laughter, now seemed strangely quiet, almost staged. I inspected every detail. Decorations folded neatly, the pool drained, chairs stacked. And then I found the note. Another one, tucked under the mailbox this time, scrawled in a way that was unmistakably hers. The message was clear. She expected compliance, and she would be watching. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the day in my mind, analyzing each interaction. Karen had turned a simple birthday celebration into a battle of wills. I knew retaliation needed to be smart, calculated, not reckless. This wasn't a moment for confrontation in person. It was a war of strategy. A plan began to form, fueled by frustration but grounded in precision. The idea of turning the tables, of exposing her overreach to the neighborhood, flickered in my mind like a spark ready to ignite. Little did Karen know, her attempt to cancel a backyard party had set in motion a chain of events that would soon spiral far beyond anyone's expectations. The HOA's interference, her relentless obsession with rules, and her desire for control had awakened a determined adversary. One who had been quietly plotting every step, gathering evidence, and imagining the perfect, satisfying reversal to be why the end of the night, I was resolute. The birthday may have been disrupted, but the story wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Karen had struck first, and now she would have to deal with the consequences. The next moves had to be precise. This wasn't just about me. It was about reclaiming personal space, celebrating freely, and showing that one overzealous HOA Karen could not dictate JOY as I lay awake. My mind filled with the blueprint for what was coming. Each detail was critical. Cameras, witnesses, documentation, subtle provocations. The eventual showdown would be dramatic, public, and unforgettable. What had started as a birthday celebration was about to become a full-scale neighborhood saga, and I was determined to ensure that the story would be told on my terms. With that, the first chapter closed, not with a confrontation, but with the quiet anticipation of what was to come. The battle lines were drawn. The HOA had delivered its warning. Karen had asserted her power, and I had accepted the challenge. The next chapter would reveal the escalation, the retaliation, and the first taste of a revenge that no one in the neighborhood would forget. The morning after my birthday, the neighborhood felt different. Something had shifted in the air, an almost tangible tension that seemed to hum around the fences, sidewalks, and manicured lawns. Karen's presence lingered like a shadow, and I knew instinctively that the incident from the day before would not simply fade away. She had underestimated me, assuming fear or submission would follow her warning. She had miscalculated. I began the day methodically, documenting everything from the previous day. Photos of the decorations, the party setup, even the sound system's volume settings were carefully recorded. Every guest's arrival and departure was noted. I created a timeline, a detailed log of events to demonstrate compliance with every HOA rule. This was no longer a casual backyard gathering. This was evidence collection, the foundation for my impending counterattack. Karen, predictably, had already started her surveillance campaign. Through the fence, I spotted her neighbors speaking quietly, presumably feeding her updates. Phones were waved suspiciously. Cars paused outside, engines idling, as if in reconnaissance. Her obsession was now public knowledge, and I realized the key to turning this feud in my favor lay in turning her own tactics against her. That morning, I planted the first seeds of strategic retaliation. Small adjustments to the yard, barely noticeable to an untrained eye, were made deliberately to irritate Karen without technically violating any rules. The inflatable pool was repositioned slightly, the balloons subtly rearranged. A single gnome was placed on the edge of my property line, just within regulations but impossibly close to where she could see it from her window. I smiled at the thought. Minor provocations that would provoke maximum reaction. Meanwhile, the HOA notices continued to arrive, escalating in tone with each day. Karen had mobilized their machinery fully, framing her complaints with an air of authority. The letters were bureaucratic masterpieces of intimidation, referencing obscure clauses and ambiguous regulations. Yet I read each one meticulously, noting inconsistencies, vague language, and loopholes. Every overreach she attempted was now cataloged as evidence for the eventual showdown. By midweek, whispers of the dispute had spread through the neighborhood. Friends who had attended the party were curious, some amused, others wary. I kept a calm exterior, allowing rumors to build quietly while I orchestrated my moves behind the scenes. The more she tried to assert dominance, the more apparent it became that her obsession had tipped into absurdity. I realized that exposure, not confrontation, would be my greatest weapon. Then came the escalation I had anticipated. A surprise HOA inspection. They arrived under the guise of routine enforcement, clipboard in hand, measuring tape in tow. Karen, of course, was there, triumphant in her role as moral arbiter. The inspector scrutinized every inch of my yard while I maintained a cheerful, compliant demeanor. I answered questions politely, handed over permits where required, and offered access to every corner of my property. The scene played out almost theatrically. A silent battle of patience, precision, and presentation. It was during this inspection that I discovered my second advantage. Neighbors who had previously ignored Karen's antics were quietly observing. Her intensity, her micromanagement, and her endless complaints were beginning to alienate her from the community. People whispered about her over coffee, in driveways and along jogging paths. The HOA's authority, once unquestioned, was now being questioned. The tide was shifting. By late afternoon, the inspector left, reluctantly nodding at my compliance. Karen, however, lingered longer than usual. Her eyes, narrowed and calculating, caught mine over the fence. In that instant, I knew she had not expected a measured, calculated response. I had remained within the rules, documented everything, and subtly undermined her influence without giving her the satisfaction of an overt confrontation. With the immediate inspection over, I moved to the next phase of my plan: subtle public exposure. Social media, long a battlefield for neighborhood dynamics, became my stage. Carefully curated photos of the party, highlighting compliance with all HOA rules, happy guests, and the fun of the event, were posted with lighthearted commentary about Karen's overzealous watchfulness. I did not name her directly. The post was merely a reflection of absurd HOA obsession, and it spread quickly. Neighbors began commenting, many expressing amusement, others outrage at the overreach. Viral attention was building. Karen predictably reacted. Within hours, new complaints arrived, both official and passive-aggressive. A single flower pot was deemed too close to the sidewalk. A minor fence adjustment was labeled non-compliant. Yet each complaint became fuel for my growing arsenal of proof. I photographed the flower pot's placement, recorded the fence measurements, and logged her timing in issuing notices. Every overstep she made became a small victory for my narrative. The more she tried to control, the more material I accumulated for the inevitable exposure. It was during this escalation that I realized the true power of patience. Karen was acting impulsively, emotionally, while I was building a methodical, structured response. Each letter, each visit, each complaint was cataloged, analyzed, and positioned for strategic impact. The HOA's power, once formidable, now seemed vulnerable to the careful application of rules, documentation, and public attention. The more she tried to dominate, the more she created opportunities for her own embarrassment. The final element of this phase was timing. I knew that a direct confrontation too early would risk diminishing the impact of my plan. Instead, I orchestrated small, innocuous provocations to keep Karen on edge. A chair slightly misaligned. A small garden ornament moved subtly closer to the sidewalk. Each act was perfectly legal but strategically irritating, and each provocation was captured visually to build a portfolio of deliberate, rule-abiding responses to her interference. By the end of the week, the stage was set. Karen had expended energy, resources, and credibility on an escalating feud with a neighbor who refused to be intimidated. The community had begun to take notice, some quietly supportive, others entertained by the absurdity. Social media engagement increased, and whispers of the HOA birthday battle began circulating beyond our street. As I surveyed the yard in the fading light of the week, I felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with birthday celebrations. This was no longer a minor feud. It was a neighborhood saga unfolding in real time. Karen's overreach, her obsession with control, and her relentless micromanagement had created the perfect conditions for a dramatic public reversal. The pieces were in place, the community's attention was growing, And the ultimate move, the move that would define the neighborhood's perception of justice, was looming just beyond the horizon. The final act was approaching, and when it arrived, it would be spectacular. Karen's attempts to cancel a birthday party had inadvertently ignited a campaign of exposure, strategy, and carefully orchestrated revenge. The HOA may have had the rules, but I had the plan, the evidence, and the patience to turn the entire situation into a story that no one would forget. By the start of the third week, the neighborhood was buzzing. Karen's relentless interference had transformed what should have been a single day of celebration into a prolonged spectacle. The HOA had sent multiple notices. Neighbors whispered in driveways and coffee shops, and my social media posts were now a magnet for engagement. The momentum I had built in secret was ready to be unleashed. The time for subtle provocations and quiet documentation was over. Now came the payoff, the revenge that would cement the story in local legend. I began by organizing a second, smaller gathering, but this time it was deliberately public and strategically designed. The backyard was spotless, every decoration aligned perfectly, every setup compliant with HOA rules. Cameras were positioned not just for personal memories, but to record every detail of the event, capturing the contrast between the fun and Karen's obsessive scrutiny. I invited neighbors I knew would quietly support me, including some who had expressed frustration with Karen's antics. This was no longer about a birthday. It was about reclaiming joy and exposing absurdity. Karen arrived as expected, arms crossed, eyes scanning with her signature mix of suspicion and self-righteousness. But this time I was ready. Every step of her approach was anticipated. The cameras captured her arrival, her expressions, and her subtle attempts to engage the HOA inspector over trivial matters. Each interaction was evidence of her overreach, and the setup ensured it would be undeniable. The event unfolded beautifully. Guests laughed, children played in the pool, music flowed, and the yard became a vivid display of community and celebration. Karen attempted to intervene, pointing out minor details, questioning volume levels, and muttering under her breath. Each act was caught on camera, a perfect juxtaposition to my meticulous compliance. The story was beginning to take shape, not just for the neighborhood, but online. I released the footage strategically on social media. Clips of Karen inspecting the yard, scrutinizing decorations, and issuing notices were intercut with shots of smiling friends, laughter, and a perfectly legal, joyful birthday party. The narrative was clear: one woman's obsession versus a community celebrating life. Within hours, the posts began spreading beyond our street. Likes, shares, and comments poured in, many with laughter, some with outrage, all highlighting the absurdity of the feud. The next move was subtle yet devastating. I compiled the evidence from the previous week, the notices, the photographs, the logs, the minor provocations I had orchestrated, and the video from the second gathering into a single, coherent document. This package was sent to the HOA board, highlighting Karen's overreach, her obsessive monitoring, and the unnecessary escalation over trivial matters. Every rule she had cited was addressed and countered with documentation, showing that I had complied perfectly while she had repeatedly pushed boundaries. Within days, the HOA responded. Karen's credibility, once unassailable, began to crumble. The board issued a statement acknowledging that my party and subsequent actions were fully compliant with community rules. They reminded all residents that personal grievances could not justify harassment or intimidation. For the first time, Karen's influence was publicly diminished, and her power over the neighborhood was visibly weakened. But the final flourish came not from the HOA, but from the neighborhood itself. People began sharing their own experiences with Karen, posting stories and pictures of minor confrontations, and reflecting on her obsession with control. The viral nature of the event had turned a single backyard birthday into a full-fledged discussion about fairness, community, and the absurdity of obsessive rule enforcement. Karen, who had hoped to assert dominance, now found herself a cautionary tale. Her emails and complaints were referenced online as examples of overreach, and the neighborhood slowly began to reclaim the atmosphere of camaraderie that had been lost. As I watched the posts and comments multiply, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not from humiliation but from justice and perspective. Karen had attempted to cancel a birthday party, but the situation had become a case study in patience, planning, and strategic resistance. What started as a personal celebration had become a neighborhood-wide lesson. Overreach, obsession, and intimidation rarely survive when confronted with careful, rule-abiding, and clever opposition. I reflected on the entire experience. The planning, the patience, the meticulous documentation, and the deliberate provocations had all been crucial. It wasn't about petty revenge. It was about reclaiming autonomy, asserting joy in the face of interference, and highlighting the absurdity of unchecked authority. And it worked. Every like, share, and comment on social media was a reminder that one overzealous HOA Karen could be held accountable. Not through confrontation or anger, but through strategy, patience, and smart exposure. The story became a touchstone for the neighborhood. Parents referenced it when setting up parties, neighbors discussed it during HOA meetings, and even new residents were subtly warned about the legendary birthday battle. Karen herself became a background character in the story she had tried to dominate. Her reputation diminished while the tale of clever resilience flourished. In the end, the birthday party was never just a birthday. It was a test of patience, a challenge to authority, and a demonstration of the power of strategy over obsession. And most importantly, it was a reminder that joy, when carefully protected, could triumph even in the face of the most persistent interference. As the sun set over my backyard, now quiet and serene once more, I took a moment to appreciate the full arc of the experience. The balloons were gone, the pool emptied, the decorations packed away, but the story remained alive. In the memories of friends, in the whispers of neighbors, and in the viral posts that continued to circulate online. Karen had tried to cancel a party, but what she had truly unleashed was a viral story of resilience, cleverness, and well-earned satisfaction. The battle was over. The party had been won, not just for me, but for the neighborhood, for fairness, and for anyone who had ever faced unreasonable interference. And the lesson was clear. A birthday party, when approached with intelligence and patience, could become a legendary act of resistance.